He fired me in the middle of lunch, mid-sentence in fact, while wiping balsamic from his cuff and casually introducing his nephew as my fresh perspective replacement. I smiled, not because I accepted it, but because I knew what he had forgotten. The original vendor contracts were still stored under my name, and his signature was missing from 2 of them. Without those, the quarterly filings would unravel in days. He handed me the check like a dismissal. I took it like a receipt. His nephew nodded with false gratitude. I said nothing. But as I walked out, I forwarded 1 document from my private drive to my personal inbox. 1 file, 1 thread. The rest was gravity. I was 38 when he promoted me to Executive Liaison, a title that meant everything and nothing. I had been at the firm for 6 years by then, having started in regulatory research and worked my way into operational integration. I spoke in few words, documented everything, and avoided the ego games that bloomed around our CEO like mold in a sealed room. My philosophy was simple. Precision protects. I never asked for credit, never corrected people when they presented my work as theirs. He once called that quiet leadership during a team meeting, but it sounded more like a brand than a compliment. His name was Dorian Kessler, founder, father of none, inkle to too many. He wore charm like a uniform and ran the firm like a performance art piece. Everyone played a part. You could survive as long as you didn't ask to write your own lines. When he smiled at you, it felt like a dare. When he praised you, it came in the form of a private text sent 3 days too late. Saw your work on the risk summary. Smart edits. No signature. No reply when I responded. When I was promoted, he asked me to keep the news quiet, to avoid drama, he said, and because the others would not understand how I work. What he meant was that visibility made things harder to take back. At first, the imbalance was easy to mislabel. He had a way of making you feel included while keeping you outside the perimeter. He asked me to join client dinners but never introduced me. He requested my input on investor decks but made sure my name was left off the distribution list. I once spent 36 hours reformatting a cross-border compliance strategy after a partner backed out mid-negotiation. He signed it in front of me, then handed the credit to a younger executive during the board review. Teamwork, he said, looking directly at me. That was the game. You were never allowed to lose, but you could never fully win. People like me, measured, exact, emotionally non-reactive, we made him nervous because we noticed things without needing to name them, because we remembered without needing to record, and because silence, when held long enough, starts to look like strength instead of submission. He made sure I was always slightly off balance, moved meetings without notice, scheduled calls 5 minutes after I had left for the day. When I asked for clarification, he called me too formal. When I stopped asking, he called me withdrawn. I learned quickly that he preferred uncertainty. It gave him space to shape the story. The others called him brilliant. I called him unmonitored. The humiliations were rarely loud. He joked once during a quarterly call that I had the emotional range of a tax form. People laughed. I did not. When I ran a department-wide review and flagged a budgeting inconsistency, he said in front of the finance team, "You have a gift for details, the kind that's hard to explain to actual decision-makers." I pretended not to hear it. He pretended not to enjoy saying it. When his nephew Jonah appeared, fresh out of a private MBA program and carrying a backpack he never opened, Dorian introduced him as a rising star we can all learn from. I was asked to show him the internal systems. He never took notes. Once, when I corrected an input error he had made, he smirked and said, "That's why we keep you around." Dorian laughed. "She's a vault, indestructible." But what he meant was silent and easily overlooked. They used words like praise to enforce hierarchy. Outside the office, the isolation spread slowly. I found myself withholding details from friends because explaining them required too much context. I stopped describing my days. My partner left that year citing emotional distance. I did not contest it. I had become a stranger even to myself, defined by output, untethered from reward. Dorian never asked about my personal life, but he once said, "You're lucky. You don't carry distractions the way others do."
What he meant was no children, no partner, no leverage. He respected my competence the way you respect a tool, useful, until it rusts. The more composed I became, the more he tried to provoke disorientation. He resented what he could not dismantle. He could not anticipate me, and that made him impatient. But he never considered I might be anticipating him. It happened during the fiscal summit, in front of 80 partners, clients, and board advisors flown in from 5 regions. I had prepped the numbers for 3 weeks, combed through vendor data, cleaned margins, built projection models accurate to the decimal. Dorian insisted I sit near the back of the room. Too many leads at the table makes the signal noisy, he said. I had already accepted the erasure. What I did not expect was the replacement. Midway through the presentation, he called Jonah, his nephew, to the stage. We thought it would be interesting, he said smoothly, to hear from the next generation of leadership. Jonah pulled up a new deck, unfamiliar to me. As he advanced the slides, I realized with mechanical clarity that it was mine. Identical structure, same insights, even the color-coded footnotes I used to guide investor pacing. But my formatting had been stripped of its margins, and my name, once embedded discreetly in the Source Data tab, had been removed. The new deck carried the Kessler crest. The board applauded after the Q&A. Dorian leaned into the mic and said, "Impressive, right? Natural instinct. That is the kind of intuition you cannot teach." Someone caught my eye from across the room, our Singapore director. She looked confused. I looked away. I said nothing. When the applause ended, I stood and left through the side entrance without being stopped. Back at my apartment, I opened my backup drive. I keep everything: changelogs, timestamps, version histories. Not for revenge, until now, but for my own sanity. I cross-referenced the metadata. My original file had been last opened 48 hours prior from a shared drive Jonah had been given access to for learning purposes. The logs showed no edits. Just a quiet download. Just enough time to reformat and present it as his own. Dorian had facilitated it, of course. He had never expected Jonah to build something, only to deliver, only to wear it like a suit tailored by someone else. The betrayal was not just professional, it was architectural. What he stole was not the work, but the possibility of recognition. He had erased the scaffolding of my precision, replaced it with lineage. What was taken was not praise, but proof that I had ever existed in the structure at all. I reacted the only way I could. I printed the logs, stored a duplicate USB with a trusted former colleague in legal, and archived the original timeline in 3 formats: PDF, raw Excel, and a backup cloud copy named Structure, Do Not Alter. I said nothing, but I moved everything. The next morning, the HR lead asked to circle up for a quick sync. Her tone was cautious. "Dorian said you seemed disengaged at the summit. He's concerned your bandwidth is misaligned with the firm's current direction." I asked plainly, "Was that feedback documented?" She shifted in her seat. "It's informal for now, but there's a discussion about recalibrating roles to support new leadership development." I said nothing, but I saw it clearly. They were preparing the narrative, slowly making room for my exit, voluntary or not. I nodded once, excused myself, and returned to my desk. That evening, I found a small envelope in my drawer. No name, just a folded sticky note inside that read, "He did the same thing to Marcus in 19. Check the Q2 deck archive." I did. Marcus's presentation on scalability frameworks had also been repackaged, reassigned, and erased. Marcus had left quietly 2 months later, citing burnout. The pattern was older than I had realized, but now I had a symbol. The USB drive, stored clean, encrypted, and untouched. The logs printed and scanned. The note slid into a folder labeled Pattern Recognition. I did not forgive. I did not confront. I reorganized. Because something had shifted. I had been erased once. I would not be again. In the days following the summit, I made myself invisible. Not outwardly. I still showed up at meetings, still responded to emails within 30 minutes, still joined the team calls and offered notes. But internally, something froze. Not in panic, but in focus. Whatever emotion had remained was burned clean by clarity. The betrayal had reshaped the landscape. What I saw now was not a man, but a structure. A network of silences and signatures, of compliance without question.
Dorian's power was not charisma. It was documentation avoidance. Nothing official, no paper trail. Praise was verbal, decisions were handshakes. Demotions came in restructured roles that required reassessment. I stopped seeing myself as the victim of one theft. I started seeing the system he had built to normalize it, and I started pulling threads. I contacted Marcus, not with accusations, just a quiet message. "I found your Q2 scalability deck from 19. Same formatting, same color model, reassigned." He replied within the hour. He told me I was too sensitive to firm-wide calibration. We met that Friday in a library cafe 2 neighborhoods away.
He brought a manila folder and 2 USB drives. "I saved everything," he said. "I just never had anywhere to send it." Inside were time-stamped records of logging access, agenda swaps, and slide deck rebrands. When he left the firm, they had issued a press release implying that he had been rotated out to pursue new ventures. He had not been consulted. He pointed to the phrasing and said, "He writes exits like they are thank you cards." I added Marcus's files to mine. Then I began to widen the circle. Erin, a former strategist turned wellness coach, confirmed she had been told to rework her tone after presenting a financial leak that implicated one of Dorian's private vendors. She sent me 2 emails forwarded from her legal archive, one from HR suggesting she voluntarily take time to consider alignment, the other from Dorian himself, congratulating her on knowing when to step aside gracefully. She had signed an NDA. She did not care anymore. "Use it," she said. "I'm done being afraid of ghosts in suits." The pattern became undeniable. Every person who had resisted, questioned, or outpaced Dorian had been erased. Not fired, but dissolved. Their departures framed as growth, as opportunity, as mutual understanding. But the data told another story. Edits copied, credits reassigned, client praise redirected. I compiled everything. Screenshots, server logs, file trees, email chains, printouts of time-stamped versions versus published versions. I sorted them chronologically, then thematically. Attribution erasure, role realignments, exit messaging language. I numbered each set and created a reference index. I stored it all on a password-protected drive and a secondary backup encrypted through a clean OS partition. One copy went to a former compliance officer I had worked with on a merger years ago. She owed me a favor. I told her, "This doesn't go live unless something happens to me, or unless I say so." She didn't ask questions. She understood the terrain. I also began collecting footage. Harmless things, at first. Team meetings where Jonah repeated phrasing I had written verbatim. Client reviews where Dorian credited ideas to executives who had joined the project weeks late. One video captured a planning session where Dorian interrupted me 3 times, then repeated my final line as his own closer. I logged the timestamps, titled the files not emotionally but functionally. Q3 called redirect. Credit lift 1207. Attribution overlap 5. This was no longer about ego. It was about leverage, about proof. I built a structure he could not reframe. In the office, I became even more precise. I mirrored his language, sent summaries after every verbal request, and CC'd on legal on all cross-departmental workflows. He noticed. He began referring to me as process-heavy in team calls. I smiled. I said nothing. The quieter I became, the more he filled the space, overcompensating, bragging, making riskier remarks. He once said, half joking, "If we didn't have her, the whole place would be a damn audit risk." I wrote it down. I did not respond. One afternoon, a new assistant asked me, innocently, why our client list formatting had changed in Q4. I told her to check the version history. She did. She found 3 credits overwritten without explanation. Her eyes changed. She said, "Oh, so it wasn't always like this." That was the moment I knew it had started to spread. The awareness, the quiet rebellion of noticing. I met with Marcus again. We cross-referenced timelines. We mapped points of duplication. We practiced what I called containment phrasing, non-accusatory language that exposed contradictions without appearing combative. We prepared for the confrontation. It would not be explosive. It would be surgical. Because I did not want revenge, I wanted air. I wanted to crack the structure open so others could see what had been built on omission. Dorian's power was never in force. It was in secrecy, in silence. And silence, like any material, fractures under pressure. You just have to press long enough and in the right place.
It was the quarterly alignment meeting, one of those events designed more for optics than for strategy, with catered hors d'oeuvres, branded folders no one opened, and just enough formality to keep dissent quiet. Dorian entered the conference space like he always did, jacket off, sleeves folded, confident grin worn like a weapon disguised as charm. The board had gathered, along with regional VPs, external partners, and Jonah, who now sat beside him as if position alone had earned proximity. I had timed it precisely. Everything I needed had already been sent that morning. One email, time-stamped and bullet-pointed, copied to every board member and stakeholder in the room. The subject line was quiet,
almost forgettable. Attribution Reconciliation Q3/Q4 Continuity. Attached were 4 folders, each labeled, each cross-referenced, each impossible to ignore. I took my seat across the room, opened my notepad, and waited. The first few minutes unfolded normally. Dorian opened with his usual loosened charisma. Before we dive in, I want to thank the team for their flexibility during transition, especially those who've taken on expanded roles. Jonah nodded. One of the board members, a woman from London who rarely spoke, interrupted. Before we proceed, I'd like to clarify something in the email that went out this morning. Dorian blinked. Which email? He asked, already stiffening. The one marked Attribution Reconciliation, she said. It references cross-departmental contributions and documented inconsistencies in project credit dating back multiple quarters. She turned to me. You compiled this? I nodded once. Yes, with corroborating data from the original authors. Dorian laughed lightly, but his voice tightened. I am not sure what we are referencing here. I assume this is some kind of miscommunication? He looked at me as if expecting me to retreat. I did not. The documents speak for themselves, and I've included access logs and version history metadata in the appendices. The room was silent. Jonah fidgeted. Another board member cleared his throat and pulled up the files on his tablet. These are serious claims. Attribution manipulation, role misrepresentation, misdirected client feedback. His voice trailed off as he read. Dorian leaned back, his smile returning like a reflex. Let's be honest here, this feels strategic, maybe even retaliatory. We're all under pressure, and I understand that sometimes when roles shift, it is not about pressure, Marcus said, standing near the back. He had been invited as an external consultant. Dorian froze. It is about patterns, Marcus continued. I was erased, Aaron was restructured, and it follows a template. Quiet reassignment of credit, informal demotion, character reframing. He held up a printed document. These are our original files, dated, time-stamped, compared side by side with the final published versions. Dorian turned to the chairwoman. You cannot take this seriously. This is a coordinated attempt to undermine— No, she said calmly. What undermines us is discrediting documented truth, especially when it comes from people who've built the very structure we profit from. His expression broke, just slightly. Enough for silence to enter. Enough for the room to shift. Jonah spoke next, voice brittle. I did not know the deck was copied. He said it was in the archive for team use. I thought it was part of onboarding. He stopped, looked down. His hands were shaking. A quiet murmur moved through the room. The chairwoman turned back to me. And what is it you want? An apology? A role adjustment? I met her eyes without blinking. Neither. I want clarity, documentation, and structural transparency to prevent this from reoccurring. Dorian laughed again, but it landed like glass breaking. So this is your little rebellion. How long have you been planning it? I looked at him, finally, fully. Since the moment you erased me and expected gratitude. The fallout began immediately. An emergency closed-door session was called. Dorian was escorted out, not forcibly, but firmly. His badge was deactivated. The board issued a temporary suspension of his executive privileges pending a full audit of attribution practices and leadership conduct. The PR team released a neutral statement the next morning. The firm is undergoing internal restructuring to reflect a renewed commitment to accountability, merit, and ethical leadership. They never mentioned names. They did not need to. Everyone knew.
Lauren, my former team lead and the only person who had once warned me, quietly, gently, years ago, texted me that night. It finally landed. Proud of you. I did not reply. I sat on my balcony in silence and watched the city flatten under twilight. I did not feel triumphant. I felt unburdened. No more invisible rules. No more erased sentences. No more pretending not to know what I had always known. In the days that followed, my role changed. Not in title, but in architecture. I drafted new policy language, clear contribution indexing, transparent credit distribution protocols, internal safeguards. I requested nothing for myself, but I made space for the next version of who I had once been. No more vaults, no more whispered warnings, just structure that held weight without silence. Dorian never reached out. That was his final miscalculation. He believed power insulated him from consequence, but power without legitimacy is just a performance, and eventually the curtain falls. Not with applause, with truth. 6 months later, the firm awarded me a discretionary leadership grant to build out an ethical operations framework, an internal engine that would live beyond any one name or executive era. I did not decline, but I did request that it carry no personal branding. Let the process stand on its own, I said. That is the point. The framework was adopted across 3 branches and quietly published in a professional ethics journal under the firm's new commitment to transparency. My role remained advisory, and that was exactly how I wanted it. Hands and structure, not spotlight. Outside the office, life had shifted into something slower, cleaner. I had reconnected with my sister, who had once said I disappeared into other people's problems too easily. We started meeting on Sundays. She brought her daughter. I listened more than I spoke. In April, I was invited to speak at a women's leadership roundtable, moderated ironically by one of the firm's former PR leads. She introduced me without embellishment, just facts. She held the ground others were taught to avoid. I spoke about structural dignity, about policy as protection, about the architecture of unseen labor. When I finished, someone from the back asked how I stayed calm. I said, I do not confuse silence with surrender. They just sound similar. In June, a certified letter arrived at my apartment. I recognized the signature instantly. Dorian's, in angular cursive. Inside was a property title. The vacation home in Maine I had once helped him structure as part of an offshore asset portfolio. Unencumbered, the document read. No note, no apology, just transfer of ownership and a stamp that confirmed its legality. I filed it in my drawer without commentary. I understood what it was. Not penance, not even closure, just acknowledgement in the only currency men like him understand. I never spoke to him. That was the severance. But I accepted the land. That was the reversal. By late summer, 3 former colleagues had reached out, each asking if I would review their new internal policies, not out of pity, but out of respect, not to restore their reputations, but to protect others. That was the shift. I had become someone people turned to not for vengeance, but for clarity, not the person who ended something, but the one who redrew the map so others could walk through it safely. One afternoon, I received a firm-wide email, buried in HR updates and benefits recalibration. It listed recent policy milestones. At the bottom, almost as a footnote, was the line, Framework designed by lead consultant and former Executive Liaison, NE, deployed firm-wide July 3rd. That was all. No press release, no photo, just acknowledgement in print. It was enough. On my final day as a full-time executive, I returned the last access badge, signed off the compliance ledger, and walked out without a farewell party. I took the long way home, stopped by a bookstore, and bought a second-hand volume on design systems. Not to study, to remember. That night, I sat on the deck of the main house. The wind came through the trees slowly, like something that had waited its turn. I watched the light fall across the stone. No calls, no noise, just space, just air. And when my sister called to ask how it felt, I said this: I did not win by destroying him. I won by refusing to play his game.